Well, it's really nice to be here with you. Look at this beautiful Sunday afternoon out there, will you? We're going to finish this series on following Jesus in a post-Christian society today. And I want to start by asking you a crazy big question. Now, the people in the morning had a struggle, but that's Sunday morning. This is Sunday afternoon. You might be just as tired, but here it is anyway. Is life meaningless or meaningful? Whoa, Josh, it's still a weekend, man. Like, why are you asking this? Well, after a year of lockdown, of cancelling things, of being stuck going around in circles, maybe this question has more resonance for you. Maybe life has felt meaningless. We work in France, as we've said, and we ask these sorts of deep questions to students. And before we went there, a dear friend actually told me, if you ever get stuck in a situation in France, you don't know what to say, don't know what to do, just do this. Try it. If you want to try it with me, I mean, you've got masks, it won't be pleasant for you. But just keep it in the back of your head, and what will happen is they will just nod and understand. And he's absolutely right. You do this, you get a situation just like, and the French go, yep, that's exactly it. And you know what? I reckon many French people would do that. If they saw that question, they'd be like, But it's a big question, actually, for our post-Christian society. It's a big question, more than for any other society, actually. Now, France is a really interesting place because I think it was and is the site of the first post-Christian society. Let me take you all the way back to the Revolution in 1789. The French society was made up of the three estates. The clergy, that is the church, the nobility, including the king and the people. And the clergy and the nobility and the king were kind of in cahoots, and it kept the people down. You can see the cartoon there. They're riding on the back of the people. They're oppressing them. And the people had a gut full of suffering, of famine, of oppression, and they rise up in the French Revolution to overthrow the whole miserable, corrupt lot. And the French philosopher Diderot says this: man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Well, it's a bit graphic, but it's creative. And you know where he stands, right? It wasn't just talk. Many of them tried to wipe religion out of society, to make it a post-Christian society. They killed many priests. They converted churches into temples of reason. They even took church bells out of the church buildings and melted them down to make cannons, to fight in their wars. And as they did, they said, down with the religious fanatics, which I always really enjoy, that they're making bells into cannons, but they're the fanatics. They changed the 7-day week to a 10-day week. You ever know that? Thank goodness that didn't last. Many people in French society back then, and now in French society, think good riddance. Thank God we're a post-Christian society. And you know, many people in Australia might think the same sort of thing. And I have to say, I like a strong opinion. If you're going to have an opinion, have a strong opinion. And I like this opinion. I like having conversations with people who have this opinion because there are good reasons to be critical of religion. As we've seen over the years, over the centuries, with the Inquisitions or Crusades or oppressions or the abuse scandal that's come out over the last decades, these things deserve to be condemned. And so we hear that critique that we should just move on, be a post-Christian society. I really do hear that. But I just want to note with you 5 things that are often missed by this idea, by this opinion. Firstly, do you know critiquing religion is a deeply Christian idea? A student that we had in our groups in France, named Etienne, started a group where he got 5 or 6 of his atheist friends, and he was all studying philosophy, and he got them together on a Friday night, and we'd read a gospel about Jesus. And as we read that, what struck them was that their critique wasn't original. That all of their critiques about religion had been anticipated in the Bible thousands of years before. Do you know it's hard to find a book in the Bible that doesn't critique religious people? genuinely, that doesn't call them silly for being gullible or for abusing the poor or for idolatry or oppressing people or for being superstitious. Do you know, listen to what Jesus says about these religious leaders back in his day. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. That's a fairly pungent quote there from Jesus. He's calling them zombies, but dead zombies who can't even get up. This is the critique. The critique isn't new, and the critique actually uses Christian morality to critique religion. That's the first point. The second point is that church failures go directly against its founder. You see, Jesus, unlike religious leaders or philosophers who've been really influential throughout history, lived out what he said. You know, some religious leaders, some philosophers, Marx, spoke for the workers, but didn't pay his housemaid. Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, and yet then lives it out. He goes and he was non-violent to the point of dying and being killed rather than resisting. We know historically he doesn't go at the head of a revolution. He gives himself up. And his followers lived this out for the first 3 centuries in astonishing ways. They were being persecuted, they were being killed, and yet they're caring for the poor, caring for the outcasts, starting the first public hospitals, starting all sorts of care for the poor around the region, starting educational things. That is, the failures of the church when they come, and we should condemn them, are way out of step with its founder, clearly. If I play a Beethoven sonata and I play it terribly, you don't throw Beethoven out for his sonata, do you? You don't judge him on my bad playing. And it's the same with Christianity and its founder. Because in the end, it's far more than a religious problem. Do you know in the French Revolution, a couple of years after the start of it, they launched in 1793 what was called le terreur, the terror. And over the course of 9 months, they killed, that is, they drowned, they shot, they guillotined 17,000 people who didn't support their vision of secular liberty. 17,000 people in 9 months. Do you know that that's 3 times as many as the Inquisition killed over 3 centuries? And yet we'd never hear about this sort of thing. No, the problem is far more than a religious problem. The 20th century has showed us with world wars, very non-religious ones, or with atheistic communism who's killed 50 to 100 million people. It's far more than a religious problem. Some will say it's a problem of ideology or belief, but no one ever did anything good without strong beliefs or an ideology. No, the problem, the Bible says, it's the human out of a person's heart that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice and deceit. That's where they come from. The fourth thing to note, I want to say, is that our deepest values in our society actually come from Christianity. Now, some might think this is controversial, but I think it's fairly straightforward. We like to think that things like caring for the poor and universal education or human dignity, we like to think they're just sort of natural, instinctive, intuitive, but they weren't. They didn't always exist. They didn't exist in the Roman Empire. They have a history, they have a genealogy. They come from somewhere. They come from a belief in the value of each human that slowly, murkily, percolates its way through society as Christian faith spreads. Caring for victims that our society loves these days, and which is a very important thing, isn't just a natural belief. It has a history where every human matters. Here's Luc Ferry, a French secular humanist philosopher, who says, it's quite clear that without this Christian re-evaluation of the human person, the philosophy of human rights to which we subscribe today would never have established itself. Again, I think this is just a matter of history. It's mostly forgotten and ignored, maybe avoided in our society, but it's just there. And finally, the question for our post-Christian society, which I think hits us the hardest, is this struggle with meaning. Is life meaningless or meaningful? Is it pointless or is it profound? And the weird thing is, it seems like it's both at the same time. Now, Ecclesiastes, we had read out, is a wisdom book in the Bible, and I think it expresses this viewpoint really well. We're just going to skate over some chapters. I'm sorry we can't plunge deeply, but here we go. Here's a first reading from verse 2. It says this: "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless." I think I'm going to put that on the meaningless side of the question, maybe. "What do people gain from all their labours? All things are wearisome. There's nothing new under the sun. No one remembers former generations." This is, some might think, a cynical view, but it's a harsh view on life, that everything is meaningless. And if you've never experienced this feeling in life, this feeling about work or anything like that, well, don't worry, you will. You will as you get older, as life comes along, as work just seems to sometimes be stuck in a rut, as relationships just seem to kind of go round and around dealing with the same problem you thought you dealt with, and you keep going. Life can feel like that. But that's not all there is to this world. The writer of Ecclesiastes says, "I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards. I made gardens, parks, planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. My heart took delight in all my labour, and this was the reward for all my toil." He's saying that there is value, there is fulfilment in this world. Our hearts can delight in our creativity, in what we can accomplish. We can do it. We can grow, we can plan, we can plant, we can work hard, and you can complete things. There is value in this world. But even that work doesn't always last. Yet when I surveyed all my hands had done and what I'd toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. And my friend who used to work in the construction industry for Lend-Lease, he was a project manager, we were talking about this a couple of years ago. He remembers 25 years ago, handing over the keys of a new building that they'd completed in Darling Harbour. He remembers handing it over to the building manager there. And as we talked a year or two ago, he said to me, "Do you know, I remember handing the keys over to that building manager. They're just knocking that building down now." The building I'd worked at with all this team. Things just don't last. They're important, they're valuable, and yet they don't last. Look at this paradox, verse 13 and 14. He says, "I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness." Some things are better than others in this world. It's better to be wise than foolish or stupid. Good's better than bad. But I came to realize the same fate overtakes them both. They both die. You can be wise or you can be foolish, and you'll both die. Here's the other paradox of work that we've already touched on. A person could do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil. And yet, what do people get for all their toil and anxious striving with which they labour under the sun? All their days their work is grief and pain. Even at night their minds do not rest. Now, I find these extreme, and yet they capture a bit. There's something of life that is sometimes in between and sometimes both we can experience. How do we deal with this paradox? Well, the French, and they've always got great creative approaches, they dealt with this with existentialism. I love existentialism. Does anyone else love it? I like the idea of thinking about existence and walking along a beach, sort of smoking a cigarette with my pants rolled up and just thinking about existence. Well, that's what they did, Sartre and Camus. I like Camus a bit more, but I'm big fans, actually. I like his writing. They're just fantastic. They used to sit in these cafes in Paris. You can still go there now, Café de Flore and Café des Deux Magots. That's not two maggots, as some people might have thought. That would not be a good marketing thing. Come to our cafe. No, it's Chinese figurine is, I think, what that means. They're still there in Paris. You can go there now. They cost a lot more because apparently those philosophers were there and they chatted. But it's fascinating. They were there and they were really facing the absurdity of life. Here's what they said: the universe is absurd, life is meaningless. Now, I do have a little theory that they were in there smoking these awful French cigarettes during World War II, the world's falling apart, and drinking French traditional coffee. And the French coffee is black, burnt, bitter, it's awful. Like, no wonder the universe is meaningless. Now, no one really supports that theory of mine, but they believed there was no greater meaning in life, there's no God, life is meaningless. And I love that they confronted that. I love they really faced up to that. And they do that. I really admire that. And their solution is to say, one must create one's own meaning. Sort of seize the day. Exist. Live. Go for it. And I like it. But I've got this niggling doubt with something in there. And I think C.S. Lewis captures my doubt in there in what he says about meaning. He says, if the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. Do you know what he's saying? If there's no meaning, well, how do we know that? And why are we troubled by it? It's sort of natural that there's no meaning. Why is there this never-ending search that grips humans above all others? Well, I think we need to understand where we've come from and why that's the case. And I think we're looking at a post-Christian society. I think we need to look a bit more closely at the word. We're using that word. We could have used non-religious, but post-Christians I think is a bit historically accurate and a bit better. But there's a problem with both of those words, and that is that they're anti-identities. That is, they're defining you by what you're not. Do you know what I mean? You know, like when a credit union says, we're not a bank. Okay, well, what are you? And it's the same here. It doesn't help us figure out what it is. And so I want to use a word, which is the word secular. Is that a familiar word, normal for many of us? It's a secular. Now, many of us think it means non-religious, and that's not bad, but we're stuck in the same situation, aren't we, non-religious? Secular actually means, a little bit more closely, I want to call it here and now. The here and now. It comes from the Latin word seculum, which was referred to the time period of one of the Roman emperors at the time, so Augustus. So you know how we count our years? This is 2021, so you might get a calendar that says, lockdown hobbies of 2021 or something like that. Well, back then they had a calendar and it was like newest aqueducts, 7th year of Caesar Augustus. That's how they managed the time. And you see, they had the eternal, which was ongoing, and age just was ageless. And then they had these seculums that come, and that's how they thought of life. It was the here and now. As another famous Australian, sort of New Zealand philosopher has said, what we do in life echoes in eternity. Do you see the secular there? What we do in life, the here and now, echoes in the eternal age. And that is how they thought back then, and that's how all societies have kind of thought in some way or another, to be honest. There's two ages, and it was an age where the eternal age gave meaning to the here and now. It was an age of discovered meaning. There was meaning in the universe, and it was up to you to discover it or to find out. And so meaning and morality and identity and authority came to us. And this is why morality had such weight back then. Because it wasn't just your idea or your group. It was like it was true for all things. It was right, really right and wrong. And that's the origin of the word secular. And over a long period of time, we could go from the Roman Empire through Christendom, those 1500 years, through to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is when things begin to change and then in modern society. And what we did was we slowly shifted the eternal out of our society. It's not that everyone's become atheist. God hasn't become non-existent. God's just become non-important. And what we did, we sort of pushed the eternal out and we brought morality and meaning and identity and authority into this age. A little bit like divers. You know how in the past you used to have like a hose attached up to the surface and they'd pump air down, I'm assuming it was air as you walked around in the underwater. Well, over time we figured out how to get the air onto our backs and sort of explore underwater like that for a while. And so that's created meaning, and this is where we find ourselves now, living in a society where the here and now gives us our meaning. Let's watch a little ad that just reminds us of this way of thinking that we all share. Oops. We all have a why. That's meaning, isn't it? And there's a whole list of things there. He, this little baby. Kindness is why. Love is why. Going further, class 4B. Australia is why. I love that ad. I love it. It's sort of a bit meaningful. It's lovely. Those things are beautiful, precious things that Telstra is using to sell us Telstra. Thanks a lot, Telstra. But they've cottoned onto something. They are where we find meaning, aren't they? In a meaningless universe, we create our own meaning. We put meaning in these things. And our post-Christian society has meaning in all those sort of things. They're beautiful. And yet all is not well in our society. All is not well with meaning. And not just because of the pandemic, but because of deep issues that are there, because of the struggle that we have of finding meaning in a meaningless universe. See, that just haunts us, these words. They're like words that so everything is meaningless. Things are wearisome. Nothing is new. Nothing lasts. Despite important, beautiful whys in the here and now, we're haunted by apathy, by depression, by all sorts of identity problems. More than any generation before, despite being richer than any generation before. You know, in France, French people are famously pessimistic. They are, despite living in, they literally do surveys on this, and sometimes they're more pessimistic than people in war-torn countries. It's outrageous that they're living in this beautiful country with mountains and beaches and lakes and coastline and architecture and art and the best wine and cheese and bread in the world. Terrible coffee, that's true. But everything's unbelievable, and yet they're haunted. Ask anyone, they will say to you, yep, this is the way it is. They're haunted by this fear that life is meaningless, or that they struggle in the face of this broken reality that doesn't live up to that ad. For instance, that ad 4B is why, is our why. And yet class 4B can also be what makes you quit teaching. It makes you want to give up your life. I've been a teacher, or start drinking. Creating your meaning works some of the time, but not forever. These things that we love, they kind of can't hold the weight that we put on them. Even love. Love is probably the most powerful force that we kind of, according to our society, that it has in every Disney movie. We love love. And whenever I think of love, I think of the song we played when my wife walked down the aisle at our wedding. It's a beautiful modern love song. It was called The Luckiest by Ben Folds. Does anyone know? You should look it up. I see there's some nodding. Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it? Oh, we love that song. It was so special. And his marriage broke up. The guy who wrote it and did his song, his marriage broke up. 3 or 4 times, actually, to be honest. And so now whenever I listen to it, I'm like, oh, man. It's just in the back of my head now. And I suppose, that's what you get for choosing some modern flighty love song for your wedding instead of some classic song that no doubt you will all have all chosen. Love doesn't last. Love can be fragile. It can't hold the weight of meaning that we put on it. It's like a rickety old wheelbarrow that we try to load all this meaning, and it just it can't hold it. And we try to cope by loading meaning onto lots of other things, lots of little rickety wheelbarrows, hoping they'll all be able to cope with them. And as we do that, then we can't cope with that, and so we try to just distract ourselves from this reality, and we watch Netflix and we commit ourselves to that, or we really get into fitness, or we really get into our cooking or our renovations or travelling. And one thing the pandemic exposed is just how fragile a lot of our meaning is. And I think Ecclesiastes helps us see why we search for meaning. That key verse, they say, I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He's made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. It's like God has hardwired meaning into the universe and into each one of us. It's just deeply in there. And the paradox is there. Do you see it there? I've seen the burden. The burden is there's a sort of burden in us, maybe a meaninglessness when we try to imagine life without God, but there's also a beauty. And we sense that meaningless and we sense the beauty at the same time. Yet we can't fully get it without God in the picture. It's like we're there. There's all sorts of things in our society. Of course, we search for meaning. And the passage that we've had read out to us tells us that God did this so that we would fear him. Now, the fear isn't some sort of terror of some tyrant or something. The fear is part of a relationship of deep, awesome regard for your Creator. Now, that's the struggle of meaning, but wait, there's more. There's other struggles I've got to offer you tonight, okay? Here's another struggle. It's the struggle with time in a busy, hurried life. See, the word for meaningless, that's in Ecclesiastes is the word heben. And it just means actually vapor or mist, fleeting, disappearing in like that. It's a critique of the here and now. And you see, as we live in our created world, in this potential world of meaninglessness, that's our society's view, create your own meaning, well, we try to control time. And so we try to live and grab each element. We try to even make time work for us in the way we do it. And it leads to a hurried life, a chasing after the wind, always on the move, always thinking about the next thing, the next appointment, what's next. What do people say when you say, how are you going? What do we say? We say busy. And it's this busy is this word that sort of communicates how we're feeling, but it also gives us meaning and identity and importance and all that sort of stuff, doesn't it? Because I'm valuable. I'm doing lots of stuff. I've got things on. I've got things on, okay? I'm not just doing nothing. But it's stressed. And it leads to distraction, and we can live out life in this constant hurry all the time. Have you seen parents on their phone when their kids are playing at the park and their kids going, "What's this, Daddy?" And you're like, yes. And this is how we live. I know, I have been this parent. I am this parent. We struggle and we're impatient. We're waiting in the car. We're going crazy and we're just impatient and stressed. And we're hurried because we're trying to control time. Hurry's not a flaw in the system. It's not a feature. It is the system. The secular's the here and now. You are going to be hurried if the here and now is your worldview, your world life. And hurry is weird. It's like a drug. It sort of comforts us and it drives us crazy at the same time. Doesn't it? We hate it, but we can't live without it. And the pandemic helped some of us because it was like a bit slower and it was sort of a bit nice. And yet at the same time, we thought there's only one thing worse than hurry, and that's not being hurried, you know. It's a hard sort of way of living, and it's a struggle. But there's another struggle I've got for you tonight, and the struggle is with stuff. Living life for gain. Look, verse 3 says, what do people gain from all their labours at which they toil? And you see, if you live in the here and now, creating your own meaning in a universe, then it always makes sense to accumulate as much as you have in that time period to gain. Now, we know all the critique of materialism is bad and consumerism and stuff doesn't buy you happiness and blah, blah, blah. Well, it may not buy happiness, but it does come tomorrow in a box. And that's pretty cool, isn't it? So stuff is always there. And when you live life about gain, then there is never quite enough. And it doesn't matter whether I say this to you or I say it to myself, I'm still looking for my next pair of shoes or whatever. Gain is always there. I still remember a birthday of the first grandchild that was old enough in our family to sort of open presents and understand they were his. And he was opening his first present. We're all watching with delight. They open it and he was all excited. And we were like, oh, this is lovely. And then he says, after this excitement subsided, he said, more? And so we gave him the next one and he kind of opened that. We saw his excitement again. He's like, oh, and he's like, more? And then we went to the next one. By the fifth one, it was grotesque. You just get more. This kid had morphed into Gollum. It was just sort of, I know that sounds a bit rough, but it really wasn't. We have to teach our kids to be thankful, right? And to be that way. But as we get to adults, as we're adults and we're living in this universe, we kind of know we should still be thankful, but to who? In a world that's meaningless, who do you have to be thankful for the things you get in your life? The universe? That we used to say you should thank your lucky stars. Not really? The burning ball of hydrogen? I don't think they appreciate my thanks. Like, how thankfulness only makes sense if there's someone to be thankful to. Life, if it's meant to be lived as a gift, only makes sense if there's a giver. When we try to ignore God, when we try to create meaning or control our time or gain stuff, it leads to a fragile meaning, a fragile life, hurried, trying to gain, trying to control. Now, what's the solution to that? Well, this series is called Following Jesus in a Post-Christian Society. And that's what I want to suggest as the solution, following Jesus. Because when you consider his example, if you've never read a gospel, and most people haven't in the world, most people have vague memories of when they were kids, but they've never read one as an adult, I urge you to do this for yourself. And if you are followers of Jesus, read the gospel regularly. Because you see his example, Jesus is a life ninja. He knows how to live life in a way that works for us. And think about how he is with time. When you read the Gospels, you notice he never seems in a hurry. He's got people all around. They're pulling him in all directions. He's got this meeting with his disciples. He's trying to teach his disciples. He's got this barbecue, this lunch. All this stuff's happening. But he's always got time. Someone interrupts him and he's not like, no, I haven't got time for that. That's what I'd be doing. But Jesus is just like, yeah. He's just never hurried because he's submitting to the time that he's in. Is the time for waiting? Then he's waiting. Is it the time for teaching? Then he's teaching. Is it the time for walking? Then he's walking. If it's the time to stop and talk to someone, it's that. Is it a time to plant or a time to uproot? So that Ecclesiastes passage we had read for us teaches us there's a time for all these things, and God has made all things beautiful in its time. Jesus knows time, but he also knows stuff. You see, things, Jesus enjoys, you might think he's an ascetic, sort of putting away all sorts of things. But if you read the Gospels, you know he's not. You know he's constantly enjoying food, enjoying parties and barbecues and, getting fish and chips for the whole crowd sort of thing. He's out there on boats in the middle of the lake. He's up there on mountains. He's up there enjoying life because he's experiencing it not as something to be gained, but as a gift to be thankful for and to be generous with. And when it comes to meaning, he finds it in God's purpose for the world. Even to the extent that his death, which we see seems to be this horrible waste, this crucifixion, what a waste of an inspirational life, but he sees it all the way through as something that will liberate people, something that will ransom people from a slavery to their own little universe. And one of his followers, Peter, writes later on in one of his letters, 1 Peter 3, sentence 18, he says, "For Christ died for sins." And you see, that word sin is what the Bible describes when we try to create our own little universes and just ignore completely God and try to control and try to hold everything together in our own worlds. That's what the Bible calls sin. And Peter says Christ died for sins, one for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you out of your closed little world like that to God. And Jesus calls people to him. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, he says this, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me. I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I think it's the hardest and the easiest thing to come to Jesus. It's the hardest because he calls you to confront your inadequacies. He says, "Come to me, you who are weary and burdened, you who are tired, you who can't do it by yourself." It can cause you to confront your failures, your faults, your flaws, your deepest things you're ashamed of, and to admit them and ask for help, for forgiveness. And he also calls you, do you see there, to give up your independence. That's that word there where he says, "Take my yoke upon you." Yoke is an unfamiliar word. Here is the picture of a yoke. It's that thing that's binding those two oxen together so you keep them straight in a paddock as you go. Now, this is a very heavy thing because it's got to control very big beasts. One of my ancestors who became a convict and came out to Australia because he tried to steal one of those. We're not going to get very far with one of them over your shoulders, are you? Anyway, they're heavy. But the yoke of Jesus, he says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." You see, everything our society tells us not to do is to submit and give something over, give your life over. Jesus says, no, you've got to do that. And my way will be better. Turn from living in your universe and live in my one with God. And what he promises is that's hard, but the easiest thing is that he gives you rest. He frees you. There's no more proving yourself, no more having to say, "Oh, I'm busy," or "I've got people after me," or "I'm important," or "I've got things on." You don't have to hide your faults anymore. You don't have to pretend you've got it all together or your universe is controllable. There's no more controlling and hurrying and gaining. There's just rest and knowing the one who understands the universe, time, stuff, meaning, and does it all for you. Let me just illustrate for you how good this is by comparing it to paths that our society offers. Now, our society is aware of the struggles of hurry and gain and materialism, and what they offer in our society is meditation, mindfulness, and minimalism. And they are great. If you read books on them, watch TED Talks on them, they have great advice for living in our crazy society. They're great. They just miss the best part. They try to have the kingdom without the king. And so what Jesus offers you is just where these ideas are pointing towards. Here's the first one. How do you deal with meaning? Well, meditation is good, being silent, hearing the breeze, feeling the breeze, hearing the leaves move, seeing the sky. That's great. How much better is it to be thankful and praise the artist that painted it all? Stopping and not merely being silent, but connecting with your Creator. How good is that? Pray to your God, pray to the Creator for delight and understanding this world. When you've got a little baby, it's 2 a.m. in the morning and you're like, what is my life about? Well, God can remind you what your life is about, of the greater purpose that you're serving there. Even as you're like sweeping a path, you're serving others in creating a path without dog poo that's everywhere in France. Meaning, asking God for meaning in your life and praying for God. God brings that to us. Here's another one, time. Mindfulness is about being present, and that's great. That's what Ecclesiastes is calling us to submit ourselves to that time, not hurrying, not being impatient. That's my massive flaw, one of my many flaws. But just going, this is the time for driving. And it's traffic, but this is the time for that. This is the time for waiting. I can try and squash something into it, or I can just sit here and appreciate what kind of beauty is there in this time. Who's around me? What are their stories? What's beautiful here that I'm missing? How good is that? And then finally, with stuff. Minimalism rightly sees life's not just about stuff, it's not about gain, but it is about gifts. Recognizing good stuff and receiving them with thanks. See, minimizing is good, but you don't want to just minimize, you want to maximize stuff by giving it and being thankful and rejoicing and being generous with it. Maybe it's renovations where you're doing that, but you're thinking, this isn't just about gaining something for me. This is about thinking about how I can serve others with it, about the stuff I buy, about how I can bless other people with it. Do you see how beautiful and powerful all this is? Can I ask, have you found the meaning at the heart of the universe? Are you following Jesus, the one who's got it all sorted? I just want to finish with a guy called Theophilus. He was a guy who found his meaning in football. He was a deep follower of Olympique Lyon, and he would go weekly to the services at the stadium. And he'd go and watch a football match, that is. And he'd sing songs with the crowd, with all the ultras. He'd breathe in the incense of the smoke from the flares. And he would find meaning in this, and mood would be altered by whether they won or lost during the week. And over the pandemic, he started coming along to church for various reasons. He was clear he wasn't into it at the start, but he was intrigued. And over the year, he just slowly became aware that Jesus connected him to God and to meaning in this universe in a profound way. And a month or so ago, he was baptized, and now he finds meaning not only in his football, but in the Lord who made everything in this universe. Can I ask, who do you have in your life that you want to share this meaning that God gives us? Let's pray, shall we? Dear God, creator of this amazing universe, thank you for the meaning you have hardwired everywhere into it, the beauty that is here, and you've hardwired even into us as well. Thank you that you help us cope even with the brokenness, even with the fragility of this world. And you show us one who knows how to live and who knows how to connect us to you. Help us to follow Jesus and to appreciate the meaning that he brings to our lives. Amen.